The apocalyptic concerns that we see around climate change today began with apocalyptic concerns around nuclear weapons. And as the Cold War ended, really the people that were looking for some kind of secular apocalypse found it with climate change, which is why I think so much of the climate activist and environmentalist community is opposed to nuclear. What bothers me is the way that this apocalyptic discourse is used to justify denying poor countries cheap baseload electricity, not just from fossil fuels, but we've also seen this effort to stop poor countries from getting large hydroelectric dams and large nuclear power plants. So what I always say to my colleagues is if you're so worried about denial, then I think you should stop trying to deny poor countries the cheap, reliable sources of electricity and energy that they need in order to survive a hotter world. We should absolutely not force poor countries to stay poor, which is basically what that would require. I mean, moving from wood and dung to burning fossil fuels is environmental and human progress. It would be unethical to punish poor countries and force them to stick with wood and coal. The reductions in emissions in the rich world are not done because we sacrificed, it's because we moved to natural gas. China and India will follow that same pathway by moving to natural gas, but it would be crazy and immoral to force poor countries to stay poor. Wealth and decarbonization go hand in hand. Energy density of fuel determines the environmental impact. Full stop. This is a physical process. The perfect environmental production methods store all of the waste at the site of production. Only nuclear does that. Only nuclear contains all of its own waste product. The nuclear waste has never hurt anybody, never should hurt anybody. It can all fit on a single football field stacked 50 feet high. As an environmentalist, this is the holy grail of energy production.
Mr. Shellenberger.
Good morning, Chairwoman Johnson, Ranking Member Lucas, and members of the committee. I'm very honored to be here. I'm an energy analyst and environmentalist dedicated to the goals of universal prosperity, peace, and environmental protection. Between 2003 and 2009, I advocated for large federal investments in renewables, many of which were made as part of the 2009 stimulus. And since 2013, I've worked with climate scientists for the continued operation of nuclear plants around the world and have helped prevent emissions from increasing the equivalent of adding 23 million cars to the road. I also care about getting the facts and the science right. I believe scientists, journalists, and advocates have an obligation to represent climate science accurately, even if doing so reduces the saliency of our issue. No credible scientific body has claimed climate change threatens the collapse of civilization, much less the extinction of the human species, and yet some activists, scientists, and journalists have made such apocalyptic assertions, which I believe contribute to rising levels of anxiety, including among adolescents, and worsening political polarization. My colleagues and I have carefully reviewed the science, interviewed the scientists and other individuals who have been making these claims, and written a series of articles debunking them. In response, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has invited me to review its next assessment report, and HarperCollins will publish our research findings as a book this June. While climate change may make some natural disasters more frequent and extreme, the death toll from extreme events could and should continue to decline, as it did over the last century by over 90%, even as the global population quadrupled. Does that mean we shouldn't worry about climate change? Of course not. Policymakers routinely take action on non-apocalyptic problems, and the risk of crossing unknown tipping points rises with higher temperatures. But we should recognize that humans are not passive victims of environmental change. The Netherlands grew very rich while farming up to 7 meters below sea level. Poor nations like Bangladesh can and should manage a gradual sea level rise of 2 feet over the next 80 years. In fact, they're working with the Dutch on that very project right now. Future food production will depend far more on whether poor farmers gain access to tractors, irrigation, and fertilizer than temperature rise, according to the best available science assembled by the Food and Agriculture Organization, which calculates crop yields will continue to rise even in high warming scenarios. And there's much we can do to reduce the impacts of climate-driven extremes. For example, the most important factors behind rising severity and frequency of fires in California and Australia are the buildup of wood fuel in forests and the expansion of homes and other buildings in fire-prone areas, both of which can be addressed to protect human lives and those of endangered species. While the world appears to be headed to temperature rise closer to 3 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial temperatures rather than 4, thanks largely to abundant natural gas, nothing is guaranteed. As such, the American people have an interest in supporting reasonable measures to transition from carbon-intensive to low-carbon fuels in order to prevent global temperatures from increasing by more than 3 degrees. The most important of these measures by far is the expanded use of nuclear energy. Thanks in part to decades of public and private investment in fracking, natural gas is today cheap and abundant and thus needs little in terms of new public policy. Solar and wind are popular, but their inherent unreliability, large land use requirements, and large materials requirements mean they make electricity expensive, have large environmental impacts, and are inherently limited in their capacity to replace fossil fuels. Consumers in states with renewable energy standards spent $125 billion more for electricity than they would have otherwise over the last decade, according to University of Chicago economists in a research report last year. Germany spent 32 billion euros annually on renewables, which is the equivalent of the U.S. spending $200 billion annually between 2014 and 2018, only to increase its share of electricity from solar and wind by 11 percentage points. French electricity, which is 72% nuclear, produces 1/10 of the carbon emissions as renewables-heavy German electricity at nearly half the price. The U.S. invented nuclear energy for civilian use in the 1950s, and yet over 3/4 of new nuclear reactors globally are being built by the Chinese and Russians. Everyone recognizes that for the U.S. to compete in building nuclear plants abroad, we must build them at home, and yet electric utilities may close half of America's nuclear plants over the next 2 decades. While the nuclear industry deserves great credit for the continuous improvement of power plant safety and efficiency, many utility executives today are either resigned to the technology's decline or engaged in wishful thinking. Even were utilities to replace every nuclear plant it closes with small modular reactors, the electricity generated would be roughly 2/3 less. And if nations were to one day opt for smaller reactors, they would likely purchase them from those nations that offer the most favorable financial terms and have the most experience, which is Russia and China. Given all of that, I would like to pose 3 questions as a public interest advocate of the environment and of nuclear. First, is it in the interest of taxpayers to subsidize U.S. electric utilities to operate existing nuclear plants in the absence of any commitment to build new nuclear plants? Second, does Congress believe the U.S. can compete with China and Russia while shutting down half to 2/3 of its nuclear fleet? Third, is Congress really comfortable standing by and watching dozens of nations partner with China and Russia to expand their use of nuclear over the next century? If the answer to the latter question is yes, I think Congress should inform the American people that it has decided to cede America's historic role as creator, promoter, and steward of the world's most sensitive dual-use technology to our main geopolitical rivals. In the 1950s, members of Congress understood the sensitive and special nature of this technology and pressured a distracted White House to make American dominance of nuclear energy a top national security priority. I think that the same thing is required today. We need a new act of Congress, perhaps a revision to the Atomic Energy Act, and perhaps we should call it a green nuclear deal in recognition of its importance, not just to national security, but also to the economy, the environment, and the climate. Thank you very much.
Where are we as a nation in advanced nuclear development, and how can we kickstart nuclear energy in the same manner as the shale revolution?
Thank you very much for that question. I actually did a significant amount of research on the historical origins of the shale revolution. And while there's a number of similarities, there's important differences as well. Obviously, the biggest one with nuclear is just that it is a dual-use technology, and so the main obstacle to nuclear's expansion has always been the fears of its use to make weapons, and that's the main reason that I think most progressives and Democrats are concerned about it. That was the nature of my opposition to nuclear as a young man. I think where it's similar is that the shale revolution occurred in the context of significant demand for natural gas. Natural gas has always been viewed as a superior fuel to coal just because of it burning much cleaner. It has half the carbon intensity of coal burning. So there was always a significant amount of demand for natural gas. We don't have that same demand for nuclear just because it's significantly less popular. I think the other big difference then is that when you look at what's actually succeeded for nuclear, both in the United States historically and with what Russia and China are doing now, is that you have heads of state directly selling nuclear power plants to other heads of state. It's a highly centralized activity. You have a single one or two firms. In the United States, it was General Electric and Westinghouse. In China and Russia right now, it's a single state-owned firm. If somebody calls up the Department of Energy in the United States and says, I want to build an AP1000, which are the reactors that we're building at Vogtle in Georgia, there's really not anybody. You would think it would be Bechtel, but Bechtel is only involved in that Vogtle project. They're not actively selling nuclear. So I think we've overemphasized the different nuclear technology designs, which just comes from a community that's very technically oriented. But what makes nuclear successful is when it's really embraced and pushed by both the White House and Congress. And we've got to be building nuclear power plants in the United States, or we're simply not going to be competitive abroad.
Expand just a little bit more on the concept about the anti-nuclear sentiment, which really first, I guess, came around in the 1960s and remains today. Can you talk about what's driving that fear and how the relationship to the broader discussion of some of the predictions about climate change, how all this interacts?
Nuclear is special. So we sometimes say we need all these different solutions for climate change, carbon capture and storage, solar, wind, and nuclear. But nuclear is unlike the rest of those. This is a radical revolutionary technological development, both in the dual nature of the technology, the incredible energy density of it. And I think that really I think the whole human race suffered a kind of trauma and shock when we invented the bomb in the 1940s. And then there was a lot of enthusiasm after Atoms for Peace in 1953 that we would sort of redeem ourselves for having invented such a horrible weapon with nuclear energy. So there's a lot of enthusiasm in the 50s. But ultimately what happened is that the fears of nuclear weapons transferred themselves, just to use a bit of psychological jargon, onto power plants, and anti-nuclear weapons activists somehow imagined that shutting down nuclear power plants would rid the world of nuclear weapons. That's really never gone away. In fact, the apocalyptic concerns that we see around climate change today began with apocalyptic concerns around nuclear weapons. And as the Cold War ended, really the people that were looking for some kind of secular apocalypse found it with climate change, which is why I think so much of the climate activists and environmentalist community is opposed to nuclear. So I think the only way to overcome, when you kind of get, to the chairwoman's question, what is the main obstacle to significant accelerated decarbonization? It's getting over our fear of this technology. Nuclear energy is our true blessing. It emits almost zero air and water pollution. In my view, it's the only true replacement of fossil fuels. Renewables are just too energy dilute and intermittent to be able to do that. So we need some kind of a shift in consciousness, and I think congressional leadership and White House leadership is really important to that.
Thank you, Michelle.
And so my question to each of you, 30, 45 seconds apiece, is what do you propose to stop India and China from emitting so much carbon?
We should absolutely not force poor countries to stay poor, which is basically what that would require. I mean, moving from wood and dung to burning fossil fuels is environmental and human progress. It would be unethical to punish poor countries and force them to stick with wood and coal. The reductions in emissions in the rich world are not done because we sacrificed, it's because we moved to natural gas. China and India will follow that same pathway by moving to natural gas, but it would be crazy and immoral to force poor countries to stay poor.
So my question to you is this. What are the major hurdles preventing nuclear from being the cost-competitive solution in the United States? And please don't say Democrats. We're in an open hearing here.
Well, the short version is there's a number of factors, but one of the main problems in the United States has been that we have many utilities, and what that means is that we've had many different operators and many different plant designs. So the economics of nuclear are really simple. The way that costs come down is by standardizing the same design, having the same people build it over and over again. That's the only way we know how to reduce costs. Also by increasing the size of the reactor. That's what's worked to reduce costs in France and South Korea, even in some parts of the United States. So that's a major obstacle. And like I mentioned, it's also been the fear of nuclear. So the way that the anti-nuclear folks drove up costs was through lawsuits and regulatory ratcheting, which delayed construction and drove up the costs. So this is why I want to warn against, I think there's a lot of wishful thinking that we're going to get some new design that's going to solve these problems, but what really matters is a long-term commitment to building the same kind of reactor over and over again, preferably with the same construction managers.
Are you aware that with the argument that the problem is storage of the waste, that's the major problem here? It's what we do in America. Of course, I'm sure you're watching the ongoing debacle about Yucca Mountain. I'm sure you've been paying attention to that. I did a little research, and there's many types, as you know, radioactive waste. The United States only has one facility engaged in permanent disposal of nuclear waste, the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in New Mexico, which permanently stores certain forms of radioactive waste generated by the DOE during research and production of nuclear weapons. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
So we've got to get better at that. We've got to come to a consensus on how we're going to handle this waste. And then we have the ultimate green energy. Would you agree?
I agree, and the only caveat I would add is that I think that the fear of so-called nuclear waste, which is just the used fuel rods, is again just a displaced anxiety around nuclear weapons. As an environmentalist, nuclear waste is the major environmental benefit of nuclear power plants. It's when you go to take an environmental studies class, the first thing you learn is that the perfect environmental production methods store all of the waste at the site of production. Only nuclear does that. Solar panels create 300 times more waste than nuclear. It's all going to go to landfills.
Say that again.
Solar panels produce 300 times more waste than nuclear. It's all going to go to landfills. Only nuclear contains all of its own waste product. The nuclear waste has never hurt anybody, never should hurt anybody. It can all fit on a single football field stacked 50 feet high. As an environmentalist, this is the holy grail of energy production.
Thank you for that. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My first question for Mr. Shellenberger. Certainly, I believe in an all-the-above approach when it comes to domestic energy production. How would you respond to those who believe that advances in renewable energy technologies have eliminated or will eliminate the need for energy and other traditional sources?
I think, and thank you for asking that question, and I'll address some of this to Mr. Perlmutter too. I think around the story. I think we have to understand that energy density of fuel determines the environmental impact. Full stop. This is a physical process. So the energy density of wood is half that of coal. The energy density of a quantity of uranium is 1 million times higher than coal. So to the question of uranium mining, well, first of all, most of it's now in situ underground. We don't actually dig anything up. But you're having this amount of uranium, or really 2 glasses worth of uranium, is enough uranium to power my entire life. So the question is, do we really need? This is the issue with renewables. Do you really need renewables if you have nuclear? Well, France did an experiment. It had 75% nuclear. It added a bunch of wind. In order to add all of that wind onto the grid, it had to increase the amount of natural gas it burned. Its carbon intensity went up. So I think we have to just ground ourselves in the fact that energy density of fuel determines environmental impact. Humans gradually move from energy dilute fuels towards energy dense ones.
So I go back to my questions.
Yeah.
Do you believe the advances in renewable energy technologies have eliminated or will eliminate the need for energy from other traditional sources?
No, and they can't, because we can't make sunlight or wind more energy dense, and we can't make them more reliable, which is why a solar farm takes 380 times more land than a nuclear plant. It's not going to change.
Okay. Next question also for Mr. Shellenberger. If you could comment on suggestions by recent articles that aggressive efforts to pivot to clean energy sources, such as outlined by the Green New Deal, might dramatically increase energy prices for consumers. As the obstetrician, young couple starting off, that energy bill, the electricity bill, was a big chunk of their income. What do you think things like the new Green Deal will do to energy prices for consumers?
Yeah, I mean, anything. What we know is that a significant deployment of solar and wind increased electricity prices. It increased electricity prices in Germany by 50%. They now pay about 50% more than their neighbors. We saw that in California, our electricity prices went up 7 times more than the rest of the United States because of our integration of renewables. There's no mystery as to why. To integrate significantly unreliable electricity onto the grid, you have to have 100% backup, usually from natural gas or some other source of energy. And of course, as you point out, raising energy prices, like increasing the price of food, is regressive. The people that suffer the most are the poor and the working class. So anything that increases energy prices is going to be regressive and harmful to working class and poor people.
Okay, I'll stay with you, I guess, for my last question. If you would kind of agree with this philosophy. To me, the greatest determinant of the carbon footprint of this world over the next decade or two will be the world economy. That if we have a strong world economy, we can do things like provide infrastructure for natural gas. To your point, in a bad economy, people burn wood, very energy light, versus being able to burn natural gas, which is going to be more efficient and more energy dense. Do you have any comments on that concept?
Well, you're right in the sense that we decarbonize along with economic growth. The idea that we need to have less economic growth in order to decarbonize is not grounded in reality. It's not grounded in historical fact. It's also obviously it's terrible for political economy, and that's the reason why climate change legislation, cap and trade legislation failed, is because people didn't want to increase energy prices. What we saw is that the American consumers benefited to $100 billion a year thanks to cheaper natural gas prices. So our emissions from electricity have been going down thanks to cheap and abundant natural gas, as our electricity prices have been going down from cheap natural gas. The French are not poor. They're the most decarbonized economy in that part, or next to Sweden, the most decarbonized economy. They're not poor because they've slashed their emissions and decarbonized their energy sector. Wealth and decarbonization go hand in hand.
The investments in technologies like that we're developing there at Purdue and help give us an advantage in this global competition, as well as if the U.S. develops advanced reactors or small modular reactors, how much of an international advantage would that give us? And is that the type of technology that is best exported, suited to be exported?
Thank you, sir, for that question. What I want to stress about advanced nuclear technologies and nuclear technologies is that they are at risk of becoming orphans without a national nuclear program, without something like a green nuclear deal. And so China and Russia are also developing small modular reactors. They're also developing non-water-cooled reactors, ones that use molten salt or liquid sodium reactors like we've developed. So when countries make decisions about who to partner with, they're actually choosing countries based on which countries have the most experience building those reactors. As a policymaker, I'm sure you can understand, if you're looking to make a big investment with taxpayer funding, you want to go with the tried and true management as well as design. And so my concern is that these promising new reactor technologies we're developing, that we're not really set up at all to be competing with the Chinese and Russians. We need our head of state selling them to compete with Putin and Xi, who are aggressively selling them. We need to have the right financing for countries. And when they say to us now, who would build this plant for us, we don't have an answer. The answer needs to either be Bechtel or some other major construction firm. And right now we sort of say to them, hey, you can pick whoever you want. When you go to Russia or China, they say, here's how it'll work. Here's the people that will build it. Here's the financing for you to build it. And like I mentioned, this is a very special technology. It's a dual-use technology. The U.S. government has always understood that the United States needed to be leaders on nuclear. And right now, I worry that we've engaged in a kind of wishful thinking that somehow some new technological breakthrough will make the difference, when in fact our technological breakthroughs just aren't that different from the technological breakthroughs that we're seeing in Russia and China.
Thank you. I would like to have you add on to that, of the technologies that we have right now, and if we could fully develop some more of those, what's the potential for nuclear energy to supply what percentage of our energy needs around the world? I
believe that eventually we will be 100% nuclear. It may not be for another 200 years, but it's such a clearly superior energy technology. I think that is eventually what will be. Obviously, France has proven that it can be 75, 80% nuclear without any problems. The United States was headed towards 50% nuclear. The anti-nuclear movement succeeded in killing half of all reactors, a little bit over half, so today we get 20%. I think it would be a perfect goal to have to get the United States back up to 50% nuclear. The market right now, Russia and China have order books of about $150 billion for new nuclear builds. This is great business. This is big construction projects, high technology, well-paying jobs. It's just, I find myself very concerned by the ways in which we're sort of sleepwalking into third place in this global competition.
Can you just give a quick 30-second illustration of fission versus fusion, and wouldn't it be great if we could get to fusion, and when are we going to get there?
Honestly, I have unorthodox view on this, which is that I think fusion is probably inevitable. I don't think it's anytime soon. It could be hundreds of years away. And I don't think that the advantages are all that greater over fission. I mean, fission already, we radically dematerialize, decarbonize with fission. Like I said, I don't think it's a technological problem. I think it's more of a consciousness problem, a fear problem, an institutional problem. I still support R&D for fusion. I just don't think it's the holy grail that a lot of other people think it to be.
At what point do you see clean energy becoming cheaper and more viable? And is it going to be a reversal of the trend that we're seeing on nuclear here in the United States?
And when you say clean energy, are you referring sort of nuclear in specific, or are you saying all low carbon energies, including renewables?
I would say, well, I was talking specifically about the nuclear end of it, because you had so much in your documentation here that I was reading about. So I would say that. Yeah, you can throw in the other ones too. I'd like to hear what you have.
Sure, I'll give you one study we did where we calculated that had Germany spent the $580 billion it's estimated to spend on renewables by 2025, had it spent it on nuclear, it would already be at 100%. Zero emissions electricity, and it would have completely decarbonized its transportation supply. Similar case in California. So it's very easy to do those calculations. The challenge for nuclear is that it requires national level commitment from the top. It really requires the president to be a leader on it. It requires significant congressional leadership. I would note that, for example, Russia also has abundant natural gas supplies, and what it's choosing to do is replace its use of natural gas domestically with nuclear power plants and export its natural gas abroad. That seems like a great recipe for energy dominance. It seems like that would be the heart of an energy dominance strategy internationally, and one that the United States would do well to follow. But again, it really requires this kind of long-term national commitment.
Absolutely. We hear a lot of extreme rhetoric. And no credible science, I noticed, I read where no credible scientific body has ever claimed that climate change threatens the collapse of our civilization or the extinction of Homo sapiens. And yet we hear politicians and the media are making these claims. I'd like to hear your opinion and tell me what you're thinking about that.
Thank you for asking that question. It's very troubling, the rise of this rhetoric. It's obviously been around for several decades, but it's become much more acute in recent years. What we've done is we've went and interviewed the scientists who activists told us they were relying on for those catastrophist claims. 4 of the scientists we interviewed all claimed that they were misquoted. One of them told us that it was based on his best estimation that the world could not sustain half of its human population at 4-degree temperature rise. We asked him what that was based on. He said it was just him speculating. In fact, there are studies by the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the major factors that determine how much food we will grow, because the only way you can really come up with collapse of civilization scenarios is with a collapse of food supply. That the major studies show that what determines food output in the future is the same thing that's determined in the past, which is whether poor countries have access to fertilizer, irrigation, and tractors. And so if we're really concerned about sub-Saharan Africa, for example, or South Asia, where people are much more vulnerable and dependent on on nature, on less resilient, then we should be helping them to industrialize agriculture, to urbanize, to gain access to factories. That's already starting to happen in Ethiopia. It should happen in the rest of the continent. So what bothers me is the way that this apocalyptic discourse is used to justify denying poor countries cheap baseload electricity, not just from fossil fuels, but we've also seen this effort to stop poor countries from getting large hydroelectric dams and large nuclear power plants. So what I always say to my colleagues is if you're so worried about denial, then I think you should stop trying to deny poor countries the cheap, reliable sources of electricity and energy that they need in order to survive a hotter world.
Technological advancements that threaten the environment too, like plastic and the large amounts of plastic that's floating out there in the Pacific Ocean and that interfere with birds and fish and eating and killing and dying and blah, blah, blah in Midway Island. Anybody got any experience on plastic and what we – yes, sir, please. Sure, please.
The one thing we do know is that what determines whether or not significant amounts of plastic waste make it to the ocean is whether or not a nation has a waste collection and management system. So we know that most of that plastic waste in the ocean is coming from countries that don't have waste collection and management systems, and the countries that don't have waste collection and management systems are poor countries. So it's another kind of case of why we need economic development.
But even we have waste collection systems, if we don't get rid of single-use plastics, and I commend my chair for having these glasses and water that we can pour rather than continue to use these single-use plastics, which so many of the committees do, which is just awful to watch and witness. But we've got to get rid of single-use plastics or we're going to continue to spoil our environment, and kill animals.
Yeah, but we need waste management collection systems to prevent that plastic from going into the oceans. This is the major finding of the Jamback study from 2015.
Well, that's true, but if we don't have all that plastic because we don't have single uses, we have less need to do that. But beyond that, I want to talk to you anyway.
Yeah, okay.
You talked about Senator Alexander, and he's my friend, and he might be for witnesses and be for common sense and the Constitution and fairness and justice and all those things. But he's not necessarily in favor of Bellefonte being redone. And you know Bellefonte in Alabama, do you not?
I do.
And there's a private group called Nuclear Development that wants to develop Bellefonte, and they want to do it privately and think they can do it. Would that not be something we need to pursue, and that's maybe where Lamar has a little error in his otherwise stellar record on nuclear?
Possibly, although my big point on nuclear is that we need a national nuclear strategy, and so we got to get away from this hodgepodge, potpourri nuclear and to have something approaching what we were doing in the 50s or something that's much more similar to what the Russians and Chinese are doing. Otherwise, it's just a kind of every day some new nuclear project that we kind of project our hopes onto, but it's not actually a plan.
But do you know anything about the Bellefonte plan? Do you know how practical that is? I mean, they've got some experts from Canada working on it.
I mean, I'm the most pro-nuclear person I know. So, I mean, I'm in favor of doing more nuclear, but I'm here to say that we've had decades of people being like, why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? And that's not a plan. The Chinese and Russians have a plan. And if we're ready to cede this dual-use technology to the Russians and Chinese, we should make that decision because right now we're just sleepwalking into it.
Let me close out with that. I'm happy to hear the Russians have a plan, because if the Russians have a plan, then Trump will have a plan. I yield back the balance of my time.